Hi.
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 Hello.
I'm curious about
Building open, authentic, loving relationship.
I'm curious about jealousy.
I'm curious about polyamory.
Does it just mean that you're fucking all the time?
How can I tell my parents that my partner is already married?
I'm curious about
How do you know when you're too busy to have another relationship?
I'm curious about dominant and subordinate relationships.
I'm curious about sexual health.
How can relationships evolve with people as they grow and change?
I think everybody should think about the relationship escalator, especially the people who really want it. Think about why you want it.
Welcome to the Curious Fox podcast, for those challenging the status quo in love, sex, and relationships. My name is Effy Blue.
And I'm Jacqueline Nisla. And today we're talking about the relationship escalator, who it works for, who it doesn't, and the alternatives, such as solo poly or singledom. The relationship escalator is the phrase that describes the prescribed social norms and sequence of steps attached to romantic relationships. From dating to monogamous partnership to marriage and a home and children until death do us part. Essentially, it's what society deems to be the path for a quote-unquote real and successful relationship.
Despite the fact that both Jacqueline and I are non-monogamous and queer, and between us, we've covered the gamut of relationship situations, from singledom to solo poly to marriage, we continue to find ourselves writing and talking about relationships from a couple's perspective on our first drafts. The idea of the relationship escalator and the couple's privilege is so prevalent, it takes discipline and perseverance to keep a broader mindset about relationships.
If the relationship escalator does not work for you, avoiding or stepping off that path can be difficult when everything in society points us towards and judges us by the escalator.
To talk to us about the relationship escalator, we spoke to the person who literally wrote the book on the subject.
Hi, I'm Amy Gahran. I am a journalist, writer, author, publisher. A lot of people know me by my book, Stepping Off the Relationship Escalator: Uncommon Love and Life.
We started by asking her to describe the relationship escalator.
Yeah, people might not have heard about it, but they definitely know it. So this is the bundle of social norms that govern how relationships that include significant levels of intimacy, especially sexual and romantic intimacy, are supposed to work, how they're supposed to begin, how they're supposed to, progress, what's their trajectory, what are their goals. I knew a few of the norms, and then with the process of doing the research for this book, I identified a couple that were kind of hiding under the surface. So the first norm, we'll call them traditional relationships, escalator relationships, is the 800-pound gorilla that's very visible, monogamy, which means sex and romance are shared exclusively between two and only two people. And so that's kind of the traditional definition of monogamy. And then comes merging, and cohabitation is a big part of this. If a relationship gets serious, eventually you're supposed to go on and want to move in together. That's about merging the infrastructure of your life, sharing finances, buying property together, all that stuff. But it's also about merging identity, about thinking and acting and presenting socially as a couple. And then there is hierarchy. And this is actually a big part of monogamy. There can be only one is one hell of a hierarchy. And the thing about hierarchy in traditional escalator relationships is that your partner on the escalator is supposed to be, with the exception of relationships that have significant care-based responsibility, like raising minor children or caring for disabled, family or elderly relatives, it's supposed to take default priority above almost every other relationship in your life. Your romantic partner, your escalator partner is supposed to take, for instance, priority over your closest friends or family members. You're always supposed to consider your escalator partner first and take care of your responsibilities in that relationship. Whatever else is left over is available for other connections that you may feel important. So those are like the big three. And then hiding under the surface, I realized another important norm of the relationship escalator is the assumption that this relationship includes sex and romance, or at least that it did at the beginning. and that this was an important part of the relationship, at least at the beginning. After that, the one that was really hiding under the surface is the presumption of continuity and consistency, that this relationship will continue on this path, and that once you reach the pinnacle of that escalator, which is a legally married and cohabitating and socially presenting couplehood, that this is supposed to be always and forever and until death do you part, which means that the only way you actually know if you've done the escalator thing right is when somebody dies. Yeah. So those were the 5 main hallmarks of escalator relationships. There are nuances. It doesn't always work in every culture or subculture. And so I'm not trying to say that for everybody in the background that they grew up in, that this is the norm for everybody, but it's the norm for a lot of people. And more importantly, it is privileged and institutionalized. For instance, legal marriage, when you look at it, is essentially institutionalized couple privilege that provides an awful lot of legal, financial, governmental benefits. You get better mortgage rates if you're a married couple that's presumed to be monogamous.
Yes. Healthcare in the United States, so tied to partnership.
One thing I learned recently is that it's hard for people who are working in government or defense jobs to get a security clearance if they acknowledge that they're not monogamous. I mean, it shows up in all sorts of weird places, but it is very privileged and institutionalized, which is important, but that's not the only reason why people ride the escalator. I mean, it works. It really works for a lot of people. Sometimes it works because of all the exoskeleton, you know, all the extra support you get because you've chosen that kind of relationship. You get a lot of extra validation and recognition and support and healthcare and all that sort of stuff, at least in the US. But it really resonates for a lot of people, and that is fine. The reason why I did this book is to let people know that the escalator is an option. It is one of many options. It's important to respect all the options that are available. And then I presented in the book what a whole lot of options look like. Basically, I went through all the escalator hallmarks one by one and gave examples of people who are not doing that particular thing.
Which we definitely want to talk about. Though I am curious to whether you have an opinion on why the relationship escalator is so prevalent, so privileged, and so adhered to. If you have any thoughts on that.
Oh, wow. You'd have to talk to a real historian about that. I've talked to a couple. The opinion I got from the historians I spoke to was mainly about how closely entwined inheritance is with wealth and property rights and political alliances. That, you know, that steered relationships to at least acknowledge monogamy. I mean, you know, most monogamous relationships throughout history were not really monogamous, but if you wanted to have an heir apparent, you had to have an official relationship that heir apparent came from. And so that's part of it. But that's just speculation. I'm really wary of kind of looking back historically and trying to imagine where the norms came from. I try to deal with society as it exists today and how it affects people.
Yeah, I imagine part of what has maintained it also is that certainly it is socially preferred.
It's not just preferred, it's promoted.
Yes.
It's promoted and subsidized.
Yes. And you've talked about the distinction between that it's not a staircase, it's an escalator. That it's moving on your behalf. And I think as a result of that, then there's less decisions that need to be made, which can be ideal for some folks. And then there's safety in that. There's safety, there's privilege, there's decision making. I don't need to have the consistent conversation around what happens next. We all know about that. We may talk about the timing of it. But when you're in the relationship, that safety, security, connection, I think is good. One of the things that I know that you've talked about and written about is that when you are ending a relationship, that those things can get in the way, right? That it's easier to make good decisions about a relationship if you don't have to worry about finances and housing and identity. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that, about this may work when you're in it. But if you're trying to exit that escalator, if you realize that you want to jump off that escalator at some point, you're hearing this podcast and you're like, oh, I didn't realize that was an option, that can be a little challenging.
A lot of that is specifically about the merging aspect of the relationship escalator, and also to large measure the social aspect of privilege. Privilege is not really just about your identity or the kind of relationship you may have. It is about how other people perceive and treat you. You know, the two things that make it really, really hard for people to leave even terrible, terrible escalator relationships is the level of especially financial entanglement and entwinement, and also worrying about the loss of social privilege, feeling like your relationship is a failure and that people will think you are a failure. That's really, really hard. That riding the relationship escalator and staying in it, even if it's hurting you, is considered a success. I got some issues with that. But also the social aspect of it is a lot of times people worry about how other people will treat them, and they have reason to be. Okay. Talk to anybody who has been divorced, and especially anybody who is older and has been divorced and is not particularly eager to get married again. It is first of all, your credit rating's probably going to take a big hit. And then that makes everything financial in your life more difficult. Health insurance will get more expensive. There are lots of institutional factors that make it daunting to leave, to jump off the escalator. And also, if most of your friends were coupled up and you decide to leave the escalator relationship, you're going to lose a lot of those friends most likely. Because couples are comfortable socializing with and mutually supporting other couples, because singles are viewed as an intrinsic threat to couplehood. And I'm speaking in absolutes here. Of course, every situation is different. But, when you take a step back and you look at the social norms, the escalator is designed to make it really scary and hard to jump off.
I just wanted to extend the point that we actually see the opposite of that in countries like Scandinavian countries, where you don't get privilege for marriage and you don't get privilege for couples. The subsidies, if you will, are individually based. When you look at those societies, there's definitely, they're like post-marriage societies. They don't, marriage is only done for romantic sort of almost nostalgic reasons, and people aren't merging lives in a way that we do in the US. So you see that the promotion and the fact that the government subsidizes these relationships, it really has an impact on the choices that we make. When you change those situations, you see whole cultures, whole societies moving away from this relationship escalator, marriage contract-based relationships.
Oh, that's true. But also what's interesting is I talk a lot with Dr. Peter McGraw, who's a sociologist and a scholar here in Colorado who studies single life and single living. And he constantly reminds people that more than half of U.S. adults live alone. They either are not currently in a relationship or they choose not to merge their relationship in that way. Sometimes they're widowed, sometimes they're divorced, sometimes they really, really wish they were partnered up. But a lot of people prefer not to merge their life, even with all the trade-offs in the U.S. that come with that choice.
Yeah. I'm seeing a trend. I'm interested if you've seen any evolution in the social norms. Some of the trends that I'm seeing is around beginning to value friendship in a different way than has been in the past, and friends and non-romantic partners living together, sharing expenses, because things are expensive out there, and those types of things. And yet, and I love the point that you made, and I never heard it this way, that a relationship is considered more valid if it started with sex. So you may not be having sex now, you may not have for years, but if it started that way, okay. But if you're friends who've been friends forever and not having sex, it sounds like then that doesn't count.
That's where the phrase just friends comes from. It's a diminishment. So yeah, that's where I'm talking about the privilege of the escalator. It's sneaky. It comes in even linguistically. This is why people, when they first start getting involved with any kind of unusual relationship community, whether it's consensually non-monogamous or kink or the asexual community, they're like, well, what's with all this jargon? Why do you need all these special words? It's like, well, because all the words we grew up with are biased toward a particular relationship structure and set of values.
Yeah. Can we talk more about couple-centric society and talk about what does that mean and look like, and then talk about what it's like to not be coupled? Because to your point earlier, I think that we see so many less examples of that, and particularly examples of folks thriving as either single or solo poly. And so would love to spend some time on that too.
Oh my God, where to start with that? Okay, so I'm here in my home, and I have my home decorated mostly with photos of people I love and who love me. And right next to my front door is a collection of photos that shows both of my sweethearts, Bill and Ted. They are the Excellent Adventure. And also my former spouse and one of my dearest friends, Tom, who actually is my neighbor and lives across the street. Two women that I consider my soul sisters, Emily and Clarice, and my dear departed friend, Michael, who was my mentor in so many ways, and a few other people. And in the middle of that, but higher up and like not really in focus, is my large Irish Catholic extended family. Literally like 52 people, I think I counted at once, from a photo where everybody's head is like tiny, tiny. You can barely see who it is. And then a photo of me and my parents and my 5 siblings. I came from a large family, grew up in a crowded house in New Jersey. And invariably, people look around, but they gravitate toward first like, oh, is one of these your boyfriend? I'm like, actually, 2 of them are. What? And then after that, they kind of back away from that and start looking at the family photos, because people get uncomfortable when they realize that what is supposed to be the most important relationship that defines you does not work with social norms. And I've seen that happen. This is why I love keeping these photos by my front door, because a lot of times when people are leaving, they'll see those photos and they'll notice it. And that's just one issue. But also, if you're taking a taxi or an Uber and the driver's trying to make conversation, they'll say, "Are you married?" That is so common, a get to know you question. Are you married? And that kind of pegs you socially. And it also gives people guidance about how they can interact with you. Do you have kids is another one. I have no kids. I'm child-free by choice. I watched Alien way too many times as a kid to ever want to get pregnant. And so there's a lot of those social questions that come up in conversation that just seem like I'm just making conversation, but really what's happening is they're trying to peg you socially.
Can you talk a little bit about then what is the experience of someone who chooses not to be partnered, singleism and what that looks like up against societal norms and couple privilege?
Sure. Well, first of all, let's make a quick distinction between solo and single. A single, while it is an identity and a valid personal choice, and many people consider themselves single at heart, the scholar Bella DePaula has written an awful lot about that. Single is largely about relationship status, that you currently have no significant relationships that involve romance and sex that have achieved a level of depth or duration. Single people, they can date, they can have sex, they have lots of friends, but they don't really have somebody that they are in love with. They are not really quote unquote committed. I'm putting scare quotes around this stuff because this is all the social norms for singlehood. Solohood is different. There can be overlap, but solohood is you may have one or more intimate relationships that really matter to you, but they are not the default priority in your life, and you choose not to merge the infrastructure of your life or identity with those people. Solos either live alone or they, don't live with any intimate partner or partners. They typically don't share property with them. They aren't legally married. They don't merge finances with them. And they still can have, if they choose, to have deep, ongoing, emotionally invested and committed relationships that can last a lifetime that just don't involve those other hallmarks. And a lot of times people dismiss those relationships as not serious or committed, without considering that maybe exclusivity, all that merging, and the hierarchy that comes along with the escalator might actually interfere with the quality and depth and duration of some people's relationships. Many people who are solo polyamorous, because they do not have the social and governmental support that escalator relationships get, they really have to focus on building a good web of connection. Resilience is a big thing in solo polyamory, making sure you have multiple people you can turn to and resources you can turn to for any kind of support that you need. Again, not universal. Some solo polyamorous are like, I am a rock, I am an island, and that's okay too. But most solo polyamorous are very aware of and take very conscious care of their network of support.
There is such a force of nature, it sounds like, within our society to draw us towards monogamy, to draw us towards primary partnership. Why would someone choose to be solo poly? And if they so choose, how can they do that well?
People end up in it by choice or circumstance. The circumstantial thing is, wow, I really thought I wanted to be on this escalator thing. And guess what? That relationship ended. Usually they were in a cohabiting relationship, sometimes married, and that ended. Or they have never been in that kind of relationship and they just haven't been able to find it. So that's kind of like the circumstantial thing. You tried the escalator, you wanted it, but it didn't work out. And then there are the people who get to it by choice. I'm kind of a blend of that. I was married and trying to be monogamous for a long time, for about 18 years. And then my former spouse and I, through a variety of stuff, became polyamorous. Then eventually we got unmarried. And the process of us getting unmarried was realizing, yeah, this living together thing, we really aren't good at that, at least with each other. And the financially merging stuff, well, that was a disaster, wasn't it? And then the identity, the social things. Well, we've each always had very close friendships with people. And so it's like that hierarchy of intimate partner and friend was never really an issue for us. We were already off the escalator in some very important ways. But I grew up in a crowded house, and I never lived alone until after my former spouse and I got divorced and sold our house. And then I lived alone at the age of 42. Then I went and moved in with a friend in Oakland for a while, and that was fine. But then I got my own solo apartment for the first time. And I had always resisted this. I thought I would be lonely. I thought I would hate it. And after a couple of weeks sitting around, it's like, this kind of rocks. So I had already been polyamorous, but then when I ended up circumstantially solo, I realized that, like, why didn't I do that to start with? Well, honestly, I didn't know it was really an option. I was a teenager in the 80s and a young adult in the 90s, and it never occurred to me that I could have any depth of love, affection, connection, intimacy, support if I didn't ride that escalator, which is why I did it.
Sure.
But it never resonated with my nature. So solo polyamorous people get at it from a variety of ways. And sometimes, increasingly, they are people who are single by choice, but who also want to start bringing more love and affection into their life. They may decide to do that in a non-exclusive way, which would be probably solo polyamory, but it can also be swinging or other kinds of consensual non-monogamy. Or they choose what's increasingly being called a partners, where you choose to have an unmerged relationship, specifically not living together. And that's becoming an increasingly popular choice for monogamous people, even married, where by choice, they decide, this living together thing, not going to work for us. So that's becoming an important thing too. But people get at solo polyamory by a variety of routes, but it is almost always at some point a choice. Because we live in a couple-centric society that pushes people toward couplehood, or at least toward having at least one important sexual and romantic partner in your life. And if you push against the tide of having that like highly merged couplehood in any way, you're already off that escalator.
That's right. And people will call you non-committal or avoidant or not a grown-up.
Let's okay, just a footnote here. Okay, attachment theory. So much of the language of attachment theory is rooted in escalator assumptions and also white middle class assumptions. So it drives me crazy when I hear everybody in the polyamorous community going on and on about attachment styles. It's like you realize there's all those categories were developed under very biased criteria, right? I don't go very far with those conversations.
I feel like all of this also leads us into a beautiful segue into singlism, which is also something that we don't hear often. Can you tell us a little bit more about what it is and how it shows up and how do you recognize it?
Singleism is about the impact of stigma. Wherever you have privilege, the flip side of it is going to be stigma. Where you have white privilege, you will have racism against people who are not white. Okay. If you have gender privilege where men are privileged, then people who are female or otherwise along the diversity spectrum or not a cisgender male will experience impact from it. This happens with singleism too. It's the flip side of couple privilege. It shows up in lots of ways. For instance, there's a fair amount of research showing that people who are single, specifically not married, but even not in a cohabiting relationship, if they're doing shift work, they tend to get less, they tend to get the crappy shifts because it's assumed that the married people need to be home with their wife and kids.
Sure.
Another thing that's interesting is that single people are often discriminated against in healthcare. Because if you are facing, saying, a cancer diagnosis and you're going to need a lot of treatment and a lot of support at home, doctors will sometimes recommend less aggressive treatment that would require the person to have more home care because they've been getting surgery or heavy-duty chemotherapy or things like that. They will often recommend less arduous and less effective treatment if they think somebody doesn't have the right support at home. Not asking people, do you have friends? Do you have family? Do you have neighbors that can help you? Do you have the resources to hire, somebody for a home care assistant? No, they ask, well, are you married? Or are you living with a partner? And if not, they will often get a very different course of treatment. This kills people. It actually kills people.
Yeah.
If you are not married, you will probably have a more difficult time obtaining a mortgage, even if your income is equivalent to what a married couple might make, because married people are considered to be a better lending risk. And think about it. How many people who have you known who are married or in cohabiting relationships where their partner is really not that supportive? Their partner might be trashing their credit rating. Their partner might be emotionally or verbally or physically abusive to them. Their partner might be incapable of offering certain kinds of support that people who are making these decisions presume they will be getting.
Yeah, and also the couple is not ironclad that one person can leave or they decide to split up. So I think there's going back to what you were saying earlier, that it's somehow considered to be a permanent thing once you're in this couple situation in an escalator, that it's permanent and forever, and that somehow that privilege will stay. Somehow you'll always pay your debt, which it's a make-believe situation that is considered as a fact and taking into consideration such a fact that your mortgage rates is a certain way, your credit lending is a certain way, which I also find quite fascinating.
Yeah. In some ways, it's similar to education privilege, where people assume that just because somebody went to college, that they're smarter, they're more dedicated, that they're more skilled.
Yeah, for sure. So given that, we know that the relationship escalator isn't ideal for everyone, though it does work for some people. And if it's working for you, we say this always on the show, like if it's working for you and you're thriving, good for you. What can we say to those people who just realize they're on an escalator and they're considering getting off? How can they do that? What is available to them? And also, what can we do overall, both personally and systemically, to support people to have relationships that they can thrive in, not necessarily subscribe to this heavily promoted prescription from system of monogamy, mononormativity?
Okay, I'm going to back up a little bit from that. You talked about people who are on the escalator and are thinking about getting off. I think everybody should think about the relationship escalator, especially the people who really want it. Think about why you want it. First of all, how much of that comes from personal desire and how much of that comes from feeling like if you are not quote unquote normal, bad things will happen to you in life. Consider, do you really want a partner or are you casting for a role? Do you really want the depth of relationship with another human being, or do you feel you need to have a specific role? This is seen over and over again, especially in cisgender heterosexual men who get married. Once they get divorced, they often want to jump right back on that escalator. You know why? Because the relationship escalator, guess what? Mostly really supports and subsidizes cisgender heterosexual men, especially white men.
Of course.
So,
like everything else.
Yeah. It's okay to follow norms because they are norms, but be conscious of it. So you asked about people who want to diverge from the escalator in some way. It's kind of like diverging from any social norms. For instance, say you are in a heterosexual, married, straight couple, and then one of you says, you know what, my gender identity is shifting. I still love you. I want to be with you, but I need to shift my gender identity or I'm just going to feel like I'm dying here. Even if that does not mean changing the structure of the relationship, and now that opposite sex is not a requirement for the relationship escalator, you could still stay on that escalator if you want. And even if the partner who has not shifted their identity still would love and respect and want to be with that person, a lot of times the questions come up. Will we need to divorce because I have shifted my identity in this way? It's not necessarily about non-monogamy sometimes. Or if somebody wants to make a big change in their lifestyle, like, yeah, I know we've had this suburban house for a while, but I really feel like I need to do RV life for a few years. Okay. There's social stigma against that. So when you separate out what you actually want versus what the impact of diverging from social stigma would be, then you can deal with the impacts of social stigma. And a big way that people can do that, even if they're just in the inquiry phase where they're wondering, maybe I might want to do something else, is reach out and start making friends and find community in that new way. Or if you are partnered with somebody, say you're monogamous and your partner says, I feel like I am polyamorous, or I want to learn more about polyamorous. Maybe this is something I can do, rather than recoil about it. And don't just leave it up to the partner who prefers polyamory to do all the work. Go out and meet some poly people and make friends. Because something that seems really scary, anything that's stigmatized is going to seem scary if that looks like that stigma is going to start attaching itself to you directly or indirectly. Stigma is a lot less scary when you start to get to know human beings as complete human beings who are already dealing with the fact that their identity or choices are stigmatized. Whether that is being polyamorous or deciding to go live in an RV or whatever. When you make friends and find community, that accelerates social learning, that reframes your mindset of what normal and healthy is or can be. And you start to see options. And the idea, you may still decide, yeah, not for me. I don't want to do it. But you won't discount it out of hand because of assumptions rooted in social stigmas.
Absolutely. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. It also makes me think of, we know that on a sort of very big scale, in an evolutionary psychology point of view, that we do have a sense of belonging as a part of our sense of safety, right? Safety in numbers was really important to us as we were evolving. And I think as you find community, I think as you diverge from the norm, the thing that kicks in on some level is that the safety in numbers. Like I am leaving the thing that keeps me safe, the big community. And I think once you do find friends and other community, then you can then appease that fear. You can then soothe that fear to say, oh, actually, here are some other people. Here's another community that I can belong. I think once that that fear is soothed, then you can go back to making some healthy decisions again. And I think that plays a role as well.
Yeah, I mean, when you think back over the history of social acceptance of same-sex relationships, what really turned the tide on that, yeah, there were a lot of protests. Yes, there was advocacy in state legislatures. What really turned the tide on this is more people decided to be out about being gay. So more people knew somebody who was gay. And it's really hard to say, oh, guess what? You're not allowed to get married if you actually know these people, if they're part of your life and your society, in your social circles.
Sure.
So I have a question about escalators within non-monogamy. So I am in polyfidelitous relationship and even though I'm in polyamorous, I have still absorbed all of that escalator expectation from monogamy and am married to one of my partners, not married certainly to the other because that's not legal. But there have been conversations in my other partnership around, well, then what next? And an expectation of, if we can't get married, then what? And what does that look like? And so those dialogues have been happening. So I get it from that side. But then from the other side, from the polyamorous community, I have received what has also felt like an escalator of we start off by opening up our relationship and having hierarchy. But then the next stage of that is non-hierarchy. And then the next stage of that is relationship anarchy. And that I'm supposed to be moving down that track. So on the one hand, I'm supposed to figure out some way of living together and getting married and doing all those stuff with multiple people. But on the other hand, I'm supposed to not have hierarchy with anyone at all, have relationship anarchy and not have labels. And so I feel stuck in the middle sometimes with this messaging.
So the relationship escalator is fundamentally about two things: relationship characteristics and presumptions about trajectory. When people say, where is this relationship going? Okay, they're talking about some kind of trajectory. It may or may not be the traditional relationship escalator. But when you start thinking about what's next, where is it going, that means that some aspect of this relationship is not meeting where you already are at some level. That you have decided maybe I'm really at the point in life where I want to live with a partner, or I want to live alone, where I want to have a kid, or I'm really sure now that I don't want to have kids, or that I really want an exclusive, sexually or romantically exclusive relationship, or that exclusivity just isn't working for me. Okay. When you've gotten to the point that it's not just about casual inquiry, but you've really recognized that something in you has already shifted, then if your relationships do not shift to meet that, you're going to be increasingly dissatisfied with those relationships. It is possible to allow relationships to change, ideally with negotiation through the people involved in it, all of the people involved in it, not just some people making decisions for other people. And a lot of people are doing that. And sometimes those decisions end up reflecting the steps of the traditional relationship escalator. And sometimes they don't. In polyland, when people talk about the poly escalator, they talk about basically the relationship escalator just with more people. People start at the entry level where they have less rights and less opportunity. And then gradually they build sweat equity in the relationship. And that allows them to basically buy in to all the aspects of merging that come with the relationship escalator. Usually on the poly escalator, it's about how do we merge more. So this is why solo polyamory is a twofer for freaking people out. Because it presumes that, I just don't want that merging. It doesn't work for me. And then egalitarian polyamory, which is the flip side of hierarchical polyamory, is a lot of people get really confused about this. And this is escalator thinking. Well, there has to be hierarchy. And if it doesn't, there has to be rank. And if there is no hierarchy, that means all relationships have to be absolutely identical, that everybody has to be on the mortgage, or you spend 3.33, days per month or weeks per month or years, equally, identically allotting time, resources, or rank, which some people do actually. Takes a hell of a lot of logistical ability, but some people do that. But in fact, what egalitarian polyamory is when partners in a relationship are on equal footing with their partners in that relationship, and their voices and choices about that relationship cannot be overridden by anybody who's not in that relationship. The relationships still usually do look very, very different from each other in a polyamorous network. But it just means that they've decided they're all just people figuring this stuff out, and they are not going to prioritize a certain person or relationship first by default. And if they do decide, if their patterns of behavior actually indicate that they are doing that kind of default prioritization, the ethical thing to do is to speak up about that. And it's like, you know what? I looked at my behavior and guess what? I am practicing hierarchy. Because when you don't do that, you get this thing called sneakyarchy.
Yes.
And it
Tell me more about
sneak
that.
up on anyone. And a lot of times the poly escalator features sneakyarchy. I want all my partners to be equal. Really, it's like Animal Farm. Some partners are more equal than others. And I'm going to prioritize them differently. But I'm still going to say, no, I absolutely am just as committed to this relationship as another relationship. And you matter just as much as the partner that I happen to live with. except that I keep making decisions and behaviors that diminish and deprioritize you. So hierarchy, it's horrible because it can sneak up on anybody. People who really ethically, by their values, want to practice egalitarian polyamory, they find out they just, aren't doing it or can't do it. And that's really distressing if you realize that you are not capable or willing to live up to your own values. That's a big point of stress.
Yeah. And I think what you're saying is the important part is the people who are in that relationship are making those decisions. I think that the distinction that you've made about hierarchy has been one of the clearer distinctions I think that I've ever heard about it, which is hierarchy is when someone outside of that relationship has control and some say in what's happening in this other relationship that they are not a part of. And I know you've talked about whether or not that is ethical, but I think that that's a good way for everyone who is trying to practice non-hierarchical relationships to think to themselves, do my other partners, do my parents, does somebody else actually have more of a say in this relationship that they're not a part of than I think that they should?
Hierarchy is a power dynamic.
Yes, and exactly. And I want to bounce off that and say, I think it's not even for those who are practicing, non-hierarchical relationships or polyamory. I think it makes sense for all of us to look at our relationships and acknowledge the power dynamics within and see if we're choosing them, if they're serving us, and if we want to carry on. And if the answer is no, how do you make adjustments? So there's so much there. And I imagine that people who are listening, I'm definitely going to be one of those people. Go back and listen again and again to really get into the nuance of what you're talking about and how much these ideas are so woven into our society, our culture, our way of living, the way that we connect and love one another and in almost an insidious way. So we think all that you've shared for us is a really good guide to take a step back and look at our relationships, our interactions, the way that we connect, the way that we form relationships and connections, and really think about, is it conscious? Are we choosing these relationships? Are we choosing the way that the relationships are? And to continue to review them and make sure that we are actually choosing it now and again now, rather than we chose it once and it's we're kind of in the flow of it and we're not really checking in anymore. And I think that will also be a really healthy way to make sure that you're thriving in relationships as well.
Yeah, and prioritize resilience, because if people get into relationships saying this will save me and this relationship should never change because my life depends on it, you're not being very resilient.
Sure.
Individual resilience, it allows for better sharing and it allows room for change and growth.
Yeah. Beautiful. Amy, you have given us a lot to think about in terms of relationship escalator and singledom and solo polyamory and all precious wisdom. We do want to learn a little bit about you, if that's okay.
Okay.
So we have 4 questions that we would love to ask. The first of which is, what is one piece of advice that you would give to your younger self about love, sex, or relationships?
Oh my God. That new relationship energy is not your friend, or at least it hasn't been my friend. That it's an intoxicant and it gets a lot of social support, just like there's a lot of social support for drinking. And like all intoxicants, it can be fun and it warrants moderation. Do not make major decisions or including your own decision about how committed you are to something under its influence. Give yourself and anybody else that you are involved in that NRE swirl, all the pink fluffy stupids, time for it to settle down and look at patterns of behavior. Keep your feet under you. Don't make major life-changing decisions until you've had a good year or more to see the patterns of behavior emerge, how you each really roll, what kind of people you each really are, and then have the relationship based on that. I went through several relationships, usually monogamous, where because I felt so in love with somebody, I figured, well, I had to find a way to make it work. And I did myself a lot of damage in the process.
Absolutely. Good advice. NRE is an intoxicant. Check. What is one romantic or sexual adventure on your bucket list?
I've done most of the romantic and sexual ones, and I purchased my own house as a long-time self-employed solo person in a crazy housing market. So those are all like bucket list things. I'm a boring person, but But for future bucket lists, I mean, the next things are finishing 2 more books. So
Nice.
Love that. The next one is self-evident potentially, but how do you challenge the status quo?
By not keeping my mouth shut.
Mm-hmm.
And that is getting increasingly hard to do in such a polarized society. A lot of people are just defensively keeping their head down and keeping their mouth shut. And I try to remember that people have very different perspectives and they come by them for different reasons. And they're complete human beings. They are not the whole of who they are. It cannot be compressed to their one opinion on one matter. But, some things really matter to me. And they're a matter of values and they're a matter of what I think make good relationships and good society. And I speak up about them. And I just realized that, and then like people come up later and say, yeah, I'm glad you said that because I just, I feel the same way, but it's like, speak up, because the first step toward tyranny is silence and self-censorship.
Sure. Beautiful. Okay, so we are a curious bunch over here at Curious Fox, and we are curious about what you're curious about lately.
I can't wait to go and see the images that came off of the James Webb Telescope today. As we're recording this, they're going to be releasing a lot of the first infrared photos that are just galaxies and galaxies, basically going back to almost the beginning of the universe. I'm such a geek. Wow. And I just can't wait to see what we learned. Science is amazing. Science. I don't know who did this quote, but I love it. It really resonates. Science is the practice of separating the probable from the possible.
That's incredible. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for your time and your energy in this conversation.
No, thank you. I mean, I know we're all over the place, and everybody, when they talk about polyamory, they expect, let's talk about sex and jealousy and all that. It's like, here I am spouting social theory, but it's the stuff that actually matters, and it shapes people's psychology and their emotions to a level that they often don't realize. Yes. And it's like, if you just sit there and say, what is this environment that I'm existing in, and how has that shaped me? Just that one inquiry can change your whole life.
Hear, hear.
If you want to learn more about Amy Gahran, read her articles, and get a copy of her book, visit offescalator.com and join her newsletter so that you can be the first to hear about when her new books are released. Stepping Off the Escalator, the second edition, which includes the latest research on relationships, and Monogamy, the fine print. If you enjoyed this episode, have questions, or have strategies to share, if you want to connect with other Foxy listeners, then head to our Facebook group at We Are Curious Foxes. You can become a Patreon member. You can get early release of episodes, mini episodes, content that we could not fit on the show, and so much more. Visit our website for blog posts, reading lists, past episodes, and more at wearecuriousfoxes.com. And then finally, let us know that you're listening. Share a comment, a story, or question, or email us a voice memo at listening@wearecuriousfoxes.com. Or you can record a question for the show by calling us at 646-450-9079.
This episode is produced and edited by Nina Pollock, with whom we have the perfect non-escalator relationship. Our intro music is composed by Dev Saha. We are so grateful for their work, and we're grateful to you for listening. As always, stay curious, friends.
Will not check the... Hang on, let me turn this off. Sorry about that.
I love that.
I love the ringtone. Good morning, Nina. Maybe it's not morning for her, but anyway.
Good afternoon, good evening, and good night. When everything in society points us towards and judges, I don't know why judges us. Can't say
because it's like a
judges. Okay. Avoiding it or stepping off the path. Stop. God, New York. There's like therapy happening on one side of the house, New York traffic.
New York happening on the other side. Curious Fox podcast is not and will never be the final word on any topic. We solely aim to encourage curiosity and provide a space for exploration through connection and story. We encourage you to listen with an open and curious mind, and we'll look forward to your feedback. Stay curious, friends.
Stay curious.
Stay curious.
Stay curious.
Stay curious.
Stay curious.
Stay curious.
Stay curious.